Samuel Drake, a veteran aerospace engineer, was enjoying his first-class seat after 30 years of hard work. But what seemed like a simple flight turned into a moment of judgment and prejudice. Can his true identity change everything? Watch to discover what happened on this fateful flight. A summer morning at John F. Kennedy Airport, the oppressive heat casting a glare across the terminal's towering glass windows. Streams of hurried travelers dragged their luggage through the chaotic symphony of the terminal. The hurried shuffle of footsteps, the constant drone of flight announcements, and a cacophony of laughter and conversation blending into the air. At the exclusive first-class departure gate for Western Sky, a near-perfect hush prevailed. Everything exuded elegance, from the plush red carpet to the polished counters that gleamed like mirrors. A few first-class passengers leisurely sipped overpriced espressos or flipped through newspapers, basking in an atmosphere that felt worlds apart from the rest of the airport. Samuel Drake entered the boarding area, his figure cutting a composed silhouette in a neatly pressed gray suit. He moved with quiet authority, pulling a simple black suitcase that matched his unassuming demeanor. His face bore the marks of time, graying hair neatly combed, a chiseled jaw softened by age, and piercing eyes framed by thin glasses. When Samuel stepped into the first-class cabin, the atmosphere seemed to still further. The seats were upholstered in supple leather, and thick velvet curtains hung softly over the windows, muting the harsh sunlight outside. Gentle lighting from individual reading lamps cast a warm, private glow over the space. Samuel placed his suitcase in the overhead compartment with deliberate precision, his movements steady and unhurried. He then settled into his window seat near the center of the cabin, where the morning light bathed the hardcover book he had just pulled from his bag, The Pioneers of Aviation. He flipped open the cover, his fingers brushing lightly over the printed introduction, as though revisiting a familiar story, one he had lived through in some way. From across the cabin, Claudia Pierce, the chief flight attendant, watched Samuel closely. A woman in her 40s with blonde hair, neatly tied back, Claudia wore her meticulously pressed uniform with the practiced ease of someone who had worked first-class flights for over a decade. Observing passengers had become second nature to her. But this time, something about Samuel caught her attention. He didn't fit the mold of the typical first-class passenger she was accustomed to serving. No designer jewelry, no state-of-the-art gadgets clutched in his hands, and certainly none of the airs of opulence or entitlement she often encountered. She tilted her head, leaning slightly toward a younger colleague nearby. In a hushed voice, she asked, "What's a man like him doing here?" The younger flight attendant shrugged lightly, indifferent. But Claudia's curiosity lingered, her mind churning through assumptions. Frowning slightly, she took a measured step towards Samuel, the steady click of her heels echoing softly through the serene cabin. "Good morning, sir," she said with a smile that was polite but strained. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'll need to check your ticket." Samuel looked up, his gaze calm yet sharp enough to make Claudia falter for the briefest moment. Without a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit and handed her his ticket. His movements were courteous yet distant, as though he had encountered such scrutiny before. Claudia glanced quickly over the ticket. It was unmistakably first class, leaving no room for doubt. Yet something about him didn't align with the image she had already formed in her mind. She returned the ticket, though the skepticism lingered in her expression. "Thank you, sir," she said, her smile fading slightly as she turned and walked away. But the unease gnawed at her, an instinct that refused to be dismissed. Behind her, Samuel reopened his book. His lips pressed into a thin line, but his eyes remained steady, fixed on the page. A quiet resolve seemed to radiate from him. A new chapter of his journey had begun, one already laced with quiet challenges, and no one in the cabin had noticed. At the first-class service counter, Claudia lingered, her mind a tangle of restless thoughts. Samuel Drake's ticket was undoubtedly first class. There was no disputing that. Yet his appearance, so understated, his quiet demeanor, didn't align with the image she had come to expect from those who frequented this luxurious cabin. She stood behind the velvet curtain that separated the service area from the passenger seats, her gaze fixed on Samuel. He was engrossed in his book, his posture relaxed, a picture of calm. Somehow, that only deepened her unease. Mandy, a younger flight attendant, noticed Claudia's unusual demeanor and spoke up. "Everything okay? He's just a passenger." Claudia turned, masking her discomfort. "I'm fine. I'm not sure if there's been an error in the system. His ticket says first class, but I think we should double check." Mandy frowned. "You don't think he belongs here? If the ticket's valid, what's the issue?" Claudia hesitated, her voice lowering. "It's not that, but it's our responsibility to make sure everything is in order. I just want to be certain." Mandy sighed, shaking her head but choosing not to press further. Claudia grabbed the scanner and headed towards Samuel's seat once more. Samuel looked up as Claudia approached. She forced a smile, one she knew didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me again, sir," she began. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to scan your ticket one more time for verification. There might have been a minor error in the system." Samuel set his book down slowly, his calm gaze meeting hers. The quiet patience in his eyes made Claudia falter, but she pressed on. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed her the ticket, this time with a subtle but unmistakable edge of authority in his demeanor. Claudia accepted it, running the barcode through her scanner. The device emitted a sharp beep, confirming without question that the ticket was valid. Still, Claudia wasn't satisfied. She bent over her handheld tablet, inputting additional commands, double-checking every detail. Everything was correct. Samuel Drake, first class, seat 3A. No discrepancies. Even so, the unease gnawed at her. She handed the ticket back with a smile that felt even more forced. "My apologies, sir. I'll need a bit more time to verify with the system. In the meantime, would you mind moving to the economy cabin while we sort this out?" Samuel didn't move immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his voice was calm but firm as he replied. "You're asking me to leave despite the fact that my ticket is fully valid?" Claudia hesitated, maintaining a veneer of composure. "We're only doing this to ensure there's no mistake. I hope you understand." Without another word, Samuel rose to his feet and retrieved his small suitcase from the overhead bin. The rustle of movement drew the attention of other passengers, their curious glances darting toward him. As Samuel walked down the narrow aisle toward the economy cabin, he could feel the weight of their stares. A few whispered among themselves, but he paid them no mind. His steps remained steady, his expression unbothered, as though this were but a minor inconvenience in a lifetime of challenges he had already endured. Claudia stood frozen, watching his retreating figure. A vague sense of unease crept over her, but she reassured herself that she was only doing her duty. Nearby, Mandy leaned toward another attendant, whispering softly, "That was strange. If his ticket's valid, why go through all that trouble?" The other attendant shrugged. "Maybe she's just not used to seeing people like him in first class." Mandy didn't respond, but the discontent in her eyes spoke volumes. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew quiet, but it was not the peaceful stillness it had been before. Every now and then, furtive glances flicked towards Samuel as he silently packed his belongings. The other passengers said nothing, but curiosity or unease was evident in their expressions. Samuel stood upright, holding his book in one hand. With a deliberate yet unhurried motion, he slid his suitcase down from the overhead compartment. Though his actions were quiet, they carried an inexplicable weight. His movements were calm, but a faint weariness flickered in his eyes, betraying the burden of countless similar experiences. Claudia stood off to the side, watching intently. She could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her now, their silent judgment seeping into the air. A flicker of doubt crossed her mind, but she steeled herself, maintaining her professional demeanor, as though everything was proceeding as it should. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Drake," Claudia said in an even tone. She avoided meeting his eyes, but in doing so, her words rang hollow. Samuel didn't reply. He simply nodded, signaling his acceptance of the situation. With his suitcase in hand, he moved down the aisle, passing the rows of luxurious leather seats. As he walked, a murmur began to ripple through the cabin. Some passengers turned their heads discreetly to whisper to one another. The soft fragments of conversation drifted through the air. What did he do to get moved? A system error? Or was it something else? In the economy cabin, the atmosphere was starkly different. Rows of cramped seats bustled with life. The cries of restless children mingled with the laughter of a group of teenagers. Passengers were dressed more casually. A few had even kicked off their shoes, reclining in anticipation of takeoff. Samuel moved through the narrow aisles until he reached an empty seat near the back of the cabin. His seat was wedged between two passengers, a weary-looking middle-aged man and a young woman engrossed in her laptop. Samuel sat down, carefully tucking his suitcase beneath the seat in front of him. This time he didn't open his book. Instead, he gazed out of the window, his focus distant, as though his thoughts had drifted far beyond the horizon. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, its radiant glow reflecting off the polished metal of the plane's wings. Zara Bennett, the young woman seated in front of Samuel, turned around slightly, glancing over her shoulder as if checking for something. Her sharp eyes landed on Samuel briefly. In that fleeting moment, she sensed something unusual. Something's off, she thought. From the cabin speakers, Claudia's voice came through, smooth and rehearsed. "We apologize for the inconvenience. This is due to a system error and is being resolved. Please rest assured that the flight will be departing shortly." The explanation sounded plausible, but to Zara, it felt insufficient. She leaned toward her travel companion, a middle-aged woman, and whispered, "Did you see that? He clearly had a first-class ticket." The woman shrugged, her expression indifferent. But Zara couldn't shake the nagging suspicion. She quietly unlocked her phone, debating whether to record the unfolding events or look up information about the older passenger who had just been moved. Samuel sat still, seemingly unfazed by the stares or whispers around him. To him, this was just another instance in a long string of such moments, a reality he had endured countless times and learned to navigate with quiet resolve. The plane remained stationary on the tarmac, the sunlight growing harsher as it filtered through the windows. But within Samuel, there was a peculiar feeling rising. Not anger, but anticipation. He was waiting for something, perhaps justice, perhaps clarity, or perhaps simply for the truth to reveal itself in its own time. The economy cabin of Flight 128 was a world apart from first class. The space felt cramped, the air thick with a symphony of sounds. The cries of restless children, the hum of phone conversations, and the creak of seats as passengers shifted to find a semblance of comfort. Samuel walked slowly down the aisle, his small suitcase in hand. He was acutely aware of the stares following his every step, some curious, others judgmental. Certain gazes seemed to silently ask, what did he do wrong? Others barely glanced at him, quickly turning away, as if avoiding involvement. Samuel paid them no mind. This was a familiar script, one he had lived through too many times. His face remained stoic, betraying no emotion. At last, he found his seat, a middle seat in the last row, sandwiched between a weary-looking middle-aged man and a young woman engrossed in her headphones. Samuel carefully placed his suitcase on the floor, then eased into the narrow seat. The cramped space forced him to adjust his position several times before he found a modicum of comfort. Unlike his usual routine, he didn't pull out his book. Instead, he gazed out the window, his eyes distant, seemingly lost among the clouds beyond. But Samuel's silence did little to quell the curiosity around him. A man seated in front turned slightly, stealing a glance over his shoulder. Nearby, a woman leaned toward her companion, whispering softly. The words were inaudible, but the tone carried unmistakable notes of mockery and suspicion. A few rows ahead, Zara Bennett, her long, curly hair framing a face sharpened by focus, was typing on her laptop. The whispers drew her attention, pulling her from her work. She glanced up, her eyes sweeping over Samuel. In an instant, she sensed that something was wrong. Zara's sharp, observant eyes, trained from her years as a law student, caught the tension beneath Samuel's composed exterior. He didn't belong in this seat, and it wasn't because of any fault of his own. Her gaze shifted to the other passengers, those exchanging smirks and sly glances. A pang of discomfort settled in her chest. Could this really be about the color of his skin? Zara wondered, her brows knitting together in thought. But Zara didn't speak up immediately. As a student of law, she had been taught to weigh every angle before acting. Right now, she lacked the full picture, just a rising sense of injustice that gnawed at her. She looked back at Samuel, searching his face for clues. Yet his expression remained impenetrable, a mask honed over decades of enduring moments like these. Over the intercom, Claudia Pierce's voice rang out from the front of the plane. "We apologize for the inconvenience. This is due to a system error, which we are currently working to resolve. Please rest assured, we will be departing shortly." Claudia's announcement sounded professional enough, but to Zara, it felt like a convenient excuse. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, and she knew she couldn't simply sit idly by. From his seat near the back, Samuel heard the announcement, but gave no visible reaction. He exhaled quietly, his gaze remaining fixed on the window. Outside, the plane sat motionless on the tarmac, the sun climbing higher, its rays glinting off the metallic wings. But within Samuel, a quiet fire burned. It wasn't anger. It was a patient, unyielding resolve, waiting for the right moment for the truth to surface. The first-class cabin retained its characteristic quiet elegance. Soft light from the reading lamps cast a warm glow over the small tables, where cups of coffee and glasses of red wine rested undisturbed. The faint rustle of newspapers mingled with the low hum of personal entertainment screens, creating an atmosphere of serene exclusivity. Victor Harlan sat near the window, a luxurious leather bag with a prominent designer logo perched on the seat beside him. In his mid-50s, Victor exuded the polished confidence of a man accustomed to privilege and indulgence. His silver hair was neatly combed, and a gold watch gleamed on his wrist as he raised his glass for a measured sip of wine. Every gesture radiated the assurance of someone who had long resided within the upper echelons of society. Victor's gaze wandered to the curtains separating first class from economy. Though Samuel was no longer visible, the image of him quietly leaving lingered in Victor's mind. A faint smile crossed his lips, but it was anything but kind. "It's getting harder to preserve privacy these days," Victor murmured, his voice just loud enough for the nearby passenger to hear. "Everyone's trying to squeeze into places they don't belong." The woman seated next to him, dressed impeccably in a tailored business suit, nodded slightly in agreement but offered no verbal response. Victor's words weren't shouted, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable to those of his ilk. Boundaries must be maintained, and those who crossed them were undeserving. Victor's eyes swept over the cabin, lingering briefly on each passenger before settling on Claudia Pierce, the chief flight attendant. She stood at the service station, adjusting a tray of drinks. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture summoning her to his side. Claudia noticed Victor's signal and approached, her professional smile firmly in place, though an unshakable heaviness lingered in her chest. "Is there something you need, Mr. Harlan?" she asked, bending slightly in a gesture of polite attentiveness. Victor leaned back in his seat, his eyes gleaming under the soft overhead light. "I saw how you handled that situation earlier," he said with a faint smirk. "Quick thinking? I suppose some people just don't understand the rules, do they?" Claudia hesitated for a fraction of a second, understanding the implication in his words. Instead of responding directly, she offered a tight, practiced smile. "We always strive to ensure the best experience for all our passengers, sir." Victor took another sip of his wine, the smirk lingering on his face. "Indeed. Let's hope there are no more disruptions. I choose first class for its tranquility, not to witness distractions like that." Claudia nodded and stepped back slightly, but his words left a bitter taste in her mouth. When she had initially asked Samuel to leave first class, she had convinced herself it was the right decision. Yet now her confidence in that choice wavered. Her eyes flicked toward the curtain leading to economy, where Samuel now sat. There was something in his expression as he departed, a profound calm, neither anger nor reproach, that she couldn't shake from her memory. It unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Victor, meanwhile, remained oblivious to Claudia's internal struggle. He had returned his focus to his glass of wine, his thoughts already shifting to the business meeting awaiting him in San Francisco. For Victor, everything was proceeding exactly as it should. The economy cabin of Flight 128 buzzed with chaos, a stark contrast to the hushed luxury of first class. Children's cries mingled with bursts of laughter and conversation, while the thud of carry-ons being shoved into overhead bins punctuated the noise as the last passengers scrambled to find their seats. Near the back of the cabin, Zara Bennett sat upright, her focus ostensibly on the glowing screen of her laptop. The bluish light illuminated her sharp features, her round glasses reflecting faint text. A final-year Columbia Law student, Zara was known for her relentless pursuit of justice. But today, her mind wasn't on the presentation she was supposed to be preparing. Instead, it kept drifting to the man sitting 2 rows ahead of her, Samuel Drake. Zara didn't know his name, but something about him captured her attention. The calm dignity he displayed as he walked past the curious and judgmental stares of other passengers was striking. He wasn't an ordinary man. There was a weight in his eyes, a quiet weariness intertwined with an unyielding patience that Zara couldn't ignore. Claudia Pierce, the chief flight attendant, had announced that Samuel's removal from first class was due to a system error and was only temporary. But Zara didn't buy it. System error? She thought, her brow furrowing. Or just an excuse to mask prejudice? Zara turned to the woman seated next to her, a middle-aged passenger engrossed in a newspaper. Lowering her voice, she asked, "Doesn't that seem odd to you?" He was clearly a first-class passenger, but now he's here. The woman glanced up from her paper with a polite, indifferent smile. "Oh, I'm not sure. Probably just a mistake." She shrugged and returned to her reading, unconcerned. Dissatisfied, Zara exhaled sharply, her gaze shifting back to Samuel. He sat quietly, his hands resting loosely on his knees. At his feet was a small black suitcase, perfectly placed, a detail that somehow conveyed an air of meticulousness. He doesn't look like someone who'd sneak into first class without a ticket, Zara thought. She had always been someone who questioned inconsistencies, who sought the truth when something didn't sit right. And this situation was no exception. She pulled out her phone, opening her notes app to jot down what she had observed so far. An elderly passenger removed from first class. Ticket was valid, but chief flight attendant claimed a system error. His calm demeanor despite the situation. As her fingers tapped out the bullet points, Zara's mind spun through potential scenarios. Was this truly a system error? Or was it a decision shaped by bias? She recalled her law classes, where she had learned about how discrimination often hid behind seemingly legitimate procedures. How prejudice didn't always announce itself, but lurked in the shadows of policy. As Zara pondered, her gaze drifted back to Samuel. This time, his eyes briefly met hers. She startled, then managed a small smile. Samuel didn't smile back, but he gave her a faint nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, as though he was aware of her watchful curiosity. The unease in Zara's chest deepened. She thought about speaking up, but in this crowded cabin, surrounded by passengers who seemed more concerned about whether the flight would depart on time than the injustice unfolding before them, what could she realistically accomplish? Her fingers moved quickly to add a final line to her notes. Need to learn more. Who is he? The cabin of Flight 128 remained steeped in an atmosphere of anticipation. Flight attendants bustled about, completing final preparations before takeoff. Passengers in both cabins occupied themselves with their own distractions, seemingly indifferent to the passage of time. At the front of the plane, the cockpit door swung open, and Captain Gordon Wells emerged, holding a small clipboard containing the flight schedule. In his early 50s, Gordon carried himself with the calm authority of a seasoned pilot. His tall, solid frame and salt and pepper hair lent him a distinguished air, while the polished gold stripes on his shoulders marked him as a figure of command. Gordon had a unique habit. Before every flight, he took a few minutes to walk through the cabin. For him, it wasn't just about ensuring everything was in order, it was about fostering trust. A safe flight begins with a connection to your passengers, he often told his crew. As he strolled through the first-class cabin, Gordon glanced at each row, greeting a few familiar faces with a subtle nod and a polite smile. Everything here met his expectations: calm, orderly, and luxurious. But as Gordon passed through the curtain into economy, the contrast hit immediately. The low hum of voices, the clatter of luggage, and the persistent cries of an unhappy child. Nearing the rear of the cabin, Gordon's gaze fell upon an elderly man seated by the window. His steps faltered. For a moment, he froze, his eyes fixed on the man as though he were seeing a ghost. "Mr. Drake?" Gordon's voice carried a mix of warmth and astonishment. "Are you Samuel Drake?" Samuel slowly lifted his head. His calm, steady eyes met Gordon's gaze. There was no trace of surprise or emotion in his expression, just a quiet nod, as though he had anticipated this moment. Though Gordon's words were not loud, they drew the attention of nearby passengers. Zara Bennett, seated a few rows away, immediately leaned forward, her sharp eyes locking onto the unexpected exchange. Gordon stepped closer, his voice tight with disbelief. "What's going on here? Why are you sitting here?" Claudia Pierce, the chief flight attendant, stood nearby, visibly uneasy at seeing the captain stop. She hurried over, her professionalism masking a growing sense of dread. "Captain," she began, "this is Mr. Samuel Drake. He was moved here because—" She hesitated, the phrase "system error" sticking in her throat. Gordon turned sharply to face her, his piercing eyes stopping her mid-sentence. "Moved to economy? Why? Claudia, do you even know who Mr. Drake is?" The question struck Claudia like a blow. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the drink tray she was holding, her eyes flickering towards Samuel as though seeking an explanation. But Samuel remained silent, his calm demeanor unshaken. He offered Gordon a faint, reassuring nod, as if to downplay the situation. Gordon took a deep breath, his gaze still locked on Samuel. Shaking his head, he exhaled in frustration. "Hold on. This needs to be addressed right now." Without another word, he spun on his heel and strode purposefully toward the front of the plane, his commanding presence signaling that whatever he was about to say would irrevocably alter the atmosphere of the flight. The atmosphere in the economy cabin grew heavier than ever. Curious eyes locked onto Captain Gordon Wells as he returned to the seat of Samuel Drake. To those unaware of Samuel's identity, the scene unfolding before them felt like a strange theatrical performance. Gordon stopped in front of Samuel's seat, bowing slightly with a reverence that betrayed his mixed emotions of astonishment and respect. His voice trembled, caught between disbelief and conviction. "Mr. Drake, how did this happen? Why are you sitting here?" Samuel lifted his head, his gaze calm and knowing. Shaking his head lightly, he replied, his voice steady and composed, "It's just a misunderstanding, Captain Wells. I don't wish to inconvenience anyone." The serene simplicity of Samuel's words only deepened Gordon's unease. Turning to Claudia Pierce, who stood nearby with her face flushed in embarrassment, Gordon's voice grew firmer. "Claudia," he said sharply, "do you have any idea who Samuel Drake is? Do you understand what he's done for the aviation industry?" Claudia opened her mouth to respond, but faltered, unable to form a coherent reply. Her eyes darted nervously between Gordon and Samuel, the weight of the moment rendering her speechless. Gordon straightened, taking a deep breath. He turned to address the economy cabin, his powerful voice resonating through the narrow aisles as if commanding every soul on board to listen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured but resolute, "I think everyone here deserves to know the truth." The cabin fell utterly silent. All eyes shifted to Gordon, who now stood like the central figure of an unfolding drama. The man sitting here, Mr. Samuel Drake, is not just an ordinary passenger. He is one of the greatest aeronautical engineers of our time. He is the architect behind many of the safety systems that all of us, myself, you, and every crew member, rely on every single day to ensure our flights are safe. Whispers rippled through the cabin like a wave. Passengers exchanged glances, a mixture of surprise and realization dawning on their faces. Those seated near Samuel turned to look at him again, their expressions now tinged with awe and curiosity. Zara Bennett, sitting a few rows away, fixed her gaze on Samuel, her earlier suspicions now confirmed. "I knew it," she thought, her sharp eyes narrowing as she glanced toward Claudia. Victor Harlan, still in first class, sensed that something unusual was happening. From his seat, he leaned slightly into the aisle, trying to catch a glimpse of the commotion. Though the words from Gordon were muffled at his distance, the gravity in the captain's voice made Victor pause, his newspaper forgotten as intrigue flashed across his features. Gordon's gaze swept across the rows of passengers. "Without Mr. Drake, I can confidently say that modern aviation would not be as safe as it is today. He has dedicated his life to research, development, and innovation. And yet, today, he finds himself relegated to the economy cabin due to a system error. Who here can accept such an indignity?" His words rang out like thunder, filling every corner of the cabin. The tension in the air was palpable, but so was the shift in perspective. Eyes that once held disinterest or judgment now glimmered with a mix of shame and admiration. A few passengers looked down at their laps, embarrassed, while others nodded subtly, acknowledging the magnitude of what they had just learned. Claudia stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the drink tray so tightly her knuckles whitened. The confident exterior she usually wore had crumbled, replaced by a profound sense of shame. Meanwhile, Samuel remained seated, his eyes fixed on the window. He neither confirmed nor denied Gordon's words, choosing instead to let the moment unfold around him. His quiet dignity seemed unshakable, even as the atmosphere around him shifted dramatically. The cabin buzzed with unspoken tension, every passenger waiting to see what would happen next, as Gordon's words hung in the air like a challenge no one dared to meet. The atmosphere in the economy cabin grew heavy, as though everyone collectively held their breath to hear Captain Gordon Wells's story. Standing tall, Gordon's voice rang out, carrying not just to the passengers nearby, but as a declaration to the entire crew, and especially to Claudia. Mr. Samuel Drake is not just an aerospace engineer. He is a legend. The planes we fly today, with their modern cabin pressurization systems, advanced fireproofing mechanisms, and auto-stabilization during storms, all exist because of his relentless intellect and unwavering dedication. All eyes turned to Samuel. Gordon's words struck each person like a resounding chord, forcing them to re-evaluate the quiet man seated at the back of the cabin. Samuel maintained his calm demeanor, but Zara Bennett, seated a few rows away, caught a flicker of emotion crossing his face. It wasn't pride or vindication. It was something quieter, a serene acknowledgement of a truth he never sought to proclaim. Gordon's voice softened, tinged with reverence. "I remember the first time I met Mr. Drake. It was at an international aviation conference 20 years ago. I was just a young pilot then, and Mr. Drake was the keynote speaker. He stood before hundreds of people, including the world's leading scientists, and made one thing clear. What must every plane in the sky prioritize? The safety of its passengers." Gordon's words seemed to stir something in Samuel. The older man turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Gordon's. In that brief exchange, Gordon saw gratitude, unspoken yet profound. Unable to sit still, Zara pulled out her phone and quickly searched the name Samuel Drake. The results flooded in, countless articles praising his achievements, prestigious awards, and a photograph of him receiving a medal at the White House for his monumental contributions to aviation. Zara was astounded, but more than that, she felt a deep sense of admiration. Victor Harlan, seated in first class, could no longer maintain his usual composure. Though he couldn't hear all of Gordon's words, he had pieced together enough to realize that Samuel was not the man he had prematurely judged. Victor lowered his head, pretending to read the newspaper in his hands, though shame gnawed at his pride. Claudia Pierce, standing nearby, felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Her mind reeled with the realization that the man she had doubted and relegated to economy was one of the greatest figures she'd ever encountered. Tentatively, Claudia stepped forward, as if to say something, but Gordon turned to face her. His gaze was firm but not condemning, urging her to confront her own mistake. Gordon surveyed the cabin once more, his voice strong and unwavering. Mr. Drake doesn't need titles or applause, but I think all of us need to recognize that without him, we wouldn't have the safety we so often take for granted every time we step onto a plane. The cabin remained silent, but this time, it wasn't the silence of indifference or suspicion. It was a silence steeped in respect. The atmosphere in the economy cabin had shifted entirely. Passengers, who moments ago had been preoccupied with their own distractions, now sat silently, their gazes fixed on Samuel Drake. The initial looks of curiosity and suspicion had been replaced with expressions of awe and respect. Claudia Pierce still stood nearby, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the drink tray. Gordon's words echoed in her mind. Mr. Drake is a legend. How had she made such a grievous mistake? It wasn't the system, she realized. It was her own unconscious bias she had been unwilling to admit. Claudia stepped forward hesitantly, stopping in front of Samuel. She bent slightly, her voice faltering. Mr. Drake, She paused, searching for the right words. I want to sincerely apologize for what happened. This was my mistake. I truly didn't mean. Samuel looked up, his eyes calm and steady. There was no anger, no reproach, just a quiet depth that spoke volumes. He replied gently, "There's no need to apologize, Ms. Pierce. Sometimes we make decisions because we believe they're right. What matters most is what we learn from them." His words left Claudia speechless. His poise didn't just make her regret her actions. It compelled her to reflect on herself. A few rows away, Zara Bennett could no longer remain seated. Rising from her chair, she approached Samuel with a mix of admiration and determination shining in her eyes. "Mr. Drake, Zara hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. "I heard what the captain said about you. What you've done is extraordinary. I'm a law student, and hearing about your work has inspired me so much. I think the world needs more people like you." Samuel offered a soft smile, the first he had shown since boarding the plane. Nodding, he replied, "Thank you. But remember, the world doesn't need more people like me. It needs people like you, young, courageous, and driven by justice." Zara's face lit up with a smile of her own, feeling as though she had just received a gift of profound encouragement. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Victor Harlan sat in silence, his expression troubled. The flippant remarks he had made earlier now replayed in his mind like an unwanted echo. He sipped his wine, but the usual rich flavor seemed to have lost its appeal. Unable to bear it any longer, Victor placed his glass down and stood up. He walked past the curtain dividing first class from economy, making his way directly to Samuel. When he stopped in front of him, Victor spoke deliberately. "Mr. Drake, I believe I owe you an apology." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Victor continued, "I was wrong. I let my narrow-minded assumptions dictate my thoughts. I judged you based on your appearance without knowing who you truly are. That was a mistake, and I'm sorry." Samuel regarded Victor, his gaze unflinching yet compassionate. There was no hint of bitterness in his voice as he replied, "Thank you. What matters isn't the past. What matters is that we can change." Victor bowed his head slightly, saying nothing more, and returned to his seat. Outside the plane's window, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, its golden light streaming through the layers of white clouds. Inside the cabin, the silence remained, but it was no longer one of unease. It was a silence of understanding and transformation. When Gordon Wells returned to the cockpit, he glanced at Samuel one last time and gave him a slight nod, a silent salute to a man he deeply respected. The plane began to roll down the tarmac, preparing for takeoff. But for those aboard Flight 128, what truly took flight that day was awareness, a hope that from this moment on, unconscious biases would be dismantled bit by bit, both in the skies and on the ground below. Captain Gordon Wells's voice echoed through the cabin speakers, calm yet commanding. "Mr. Samuel Drake, please return to your seat in first class. It is where you rightfully belong." The reverent invitation was more than a simple correction of a seating error. It was a public acknowledgement of Samuel's worth, a declaration of respect, and an effort to make amends. Samuel rose slowly. As he looked around the economy cabin, the same faces that had once cast doubtful, scrutinizing glances at him now wore different expressions. Their eyes no longer carried suspicion or judgment. Instead, they reflected discomfort, even respect. Zara Bennett watched every movement Samuel made. She noticed the calm precision in how he picked up his small black suitcase, his unhurried steps as he made his way down the narrow aisle. To Zara, this older man had become a symbol of quiet resilience and unshakable dignity. As Samuel passed through the curtain dividing the two cabins, he approached Claudia Pierce, who stood waiting with her hands clasped tightly. Her head dipped slightly in acknowledgement, her face etched with remorse. Though she didn't speak, her posture radiated a silent, heartfelt apology. Samuel met her gaze briefly and gave her a small nod. He said nothing, but the gesture was enough. It was a quiet assurance that while the wounds of the moment couldn't be erased instantly, she would have her chance to grow from it. In the first-class cabin, Samuel returned to his seat, where his glass of sparkling water still sat untouched on the sleek wooden table. Settling into his chair, he straightened his blazer and placed his suitcase neatly at his feet. The silence around him was almost palpable. Victor Harlan, seated nearby, peered over the top of his newspaper, his eyes lingering on Samuel. The prejudiced remarks Victor had so casually voiced earlier now replayed in his mind, sounding absurd and embarrassing. Lowering the newspaper, he folded it neatly on the table in front of him, crossing his arms and fixing his gaze straight ahead, trying and failing to mask his discomfort. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman wearing a pearl necklace, tilted her head slightly, her eyes studying Samuel with curiosity laced with newfound respect. Samuel opened The Pioneers of Aviation, the book he had set aside when the ordeal began. But this time, he didn't immediately flip to the page he had left off. Instead, he sat motionless, as if reflecting on something far greater than the contents of the book. The tension that had once filled the first-class cabin had dissolved, replaced by a solemn, contemplative quiet. No one spoke. No one appeared engrossed in the usual distractions of a flight. It was as if Samuel's presence had shifted the dynamic entirely, compelling each passenger to question themselves. What would they do the next time they encountered prejudice? Outside the window, the morning sun continued to shine brightly, casting its golden light over the plane's wings. But within the cabin, something far more profound was unfolding. Western Sky Flight 128 finally ascended gracefully, leaving the ground behind. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, a sound Samuel Drake knew like an old melody. Leaning back in his first-class seat, he closed his eyes, feeling the moment the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Then, he quietly opened them. Samuel took a deep breath, folded the book in his hands, and set it aside. Slowly, he rose from his seat. His tall frame, silver-streaked hair, and impeccably tailored gray suit radiated quiet authority. One by one, the passengers in first class turned their attention to him. He moved toward the front of the cabin, his gaze sweeping across the entire plane, from those seated comfortably in first class to the passengers packed into the economy section. The faint murmur scattered throughout the aircraft gradually fell silent. Samuel picked up the small microphone mounted beside the lead flight attendant station. His warm, steady voice resonated through the speakers, clear enough for every passenger to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me a moment of your time." He paused, his eyes momentarily lingering on the curtains separating the two cabins, ensuring his words reached everyone, regardless of where they sat. "I'm not here to speak about my name or my achievements. None of that matters," Samuel began, his voice calm but weighted with meaning. "I want to talk about the power of prejudice. It's invisible, yet it shapes how we think, how we see others, and how we treat them, often based on nothing more than appearances." The cabin fell into an almost palpable silence. Each word he spoke carried gravity, sinking into the minds of everyone listening. "We all make mistakes," Samuel continued, his gaze briefly resting on Claudia Pierce, who stood quietly in the corner of the cabin, her face flushed with unease. But the greatest mistake is making decisions without enough understanding. Decisions that not only harm others, but also rob us of the chance to learn and grow. His words rippled through the cabin, causing passengers to unconsciously reevaluate their own actions and assumptions. Claudia lowered her head, her hands clenched tightly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Prejudice is not something we're bound to," Samuel said, his tone softening, imbued with a sense of reassurance. "It can be unlearned if we're brave enough to admit our mistakes and open our hearts. Change begins with understanding, and understanding begins with listening." He paused once more, his eyes sweeping the cabin, locking briefly with Zara Bennett, who was leaning forward in her seat in the economy section, hanging on every word. Then, Samuel gently set the microphone down. "Thank you for your time." The atmosphere in the cabin seemed frozen in time. For a few moments, silence reigned. No one spoke, no one moved. Then Zara Bennett, seated in economy class, was the first to break it. Her applause rang out, firm and resolute, cutting through the stillness with quiet authority. One by one, the passengers began to join in. The sound of clapping rippled through the cabin, spreading from economy to first class. It wasn't boisterous, but it carried an undeniable weight, a symphony of respect, regret, and admiration for Samuel's profoundly moving words. Applause erupted from Zara Bennett in the economy cabin, firm and brimming with emotion. It was like a tiny spark igniting a quietly burning fire in the hearts of the other passengers. Moments later, a middle-aged woman nearby joined in. The clapping spread, one person, one row at a time, until the entire cabin was alive with the sound. Zara stood tall, turning to face the passengers behind her, as if encouraging them to join. On her face, admiration for Samuel was laid bare, unashamed and unapologetic. In first class, Victor Harlan, ever prideful and aloof, sat motionless at first, arms still folded across his chest. But the applause, like waves crashing against a stubborn cliff, forced him to confront the prejudice in his own heart. At last, he lowered the newspaper in his hands, clasped them together, and began to clap, slowly but sincerely. Samuel said nothing. He simply bowed his head slightly, acknowledging their applause with a humble smile. The clapping continued for a few moments before gradually fading, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with emotion. Claudia Pierce, standing near the back of the first-class cabin, felt her heartbeat quicken. From the moment Samuel began his speech, she had realized not only the error of her ways, but also the burden of injustice she had placed upon a man who deserved none of it. Drawing a deep breath, she stepped forward, stopping just before Samuel. Her eyes wavered, and her hands were nervously clasped together. "Mr. Drake," she began, her voice quiet yet sincere, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to doubt you and to make decisions without knowing the full truth. I can't undo what I've done, but I promise you this. I will change. I won't let prejudice guide me again." Samuel regarded Claudia. He didn't respond immediately, but studied her face. In her eyes, he saw true contrition, not a hollow attempt at reconciliation. With a small nod, he replied in a steady voice, "Thank you, Miss Pierce. Recognizing one's mistakes and choosing to change is no small thing. I believe you can do it." His words brought a shimmer of tears to Claudia's eyes. She lowered her head slightly and stepped back to give him space. From her seat, Zara watched the scene unfold, satisfaction evident on her face. She felt that Samuel's words had not only touched one person, but resonated throughout the cabin. Sitting back down, she pulled out her phone and began typing a short note, an idea for her next essay. The power of words, when paired with patience and kindness, can change everything, even the deepest of prejudices. Victor Harlan hesitated for a moment before standing. He walked slowly towards Samuel, his usual air of superiority replaced by visible unease. "Mr. Drake," he began, his voice low but earnest, "I owe you an apology as well. I was wrong to judge you without knowing who you are, or more importantly, what you mean to this industry. I deeply regret my actions." Samuel met Victor's gaze, his expression free of reproach. Extending his hand, he said, "Thank you. We all make mistakes. What matters most is how we choose to make them right." Victor paused briefly before taking Samuel's hand in a firm handshake. In that moment, he felt as if a weight he hadn't known he carried had been lifted. The entire cabin, though silent, shared an unspoken understanding. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. Flight 128 had not only carried them from New York to San Francisco, but had also brought them closer to a profound shift in perspective. Samuel returned to his seat in first class. Adjusting his suit jacket, he settled into the chair and leaned forward to pick up the book The Pioneers of Aviation that lay on the table before him. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated his face, highlighting the deep lines etched by time, marks of a life dedicated to purpose. Outside, the plane glided through the vast, endless blue, leaving a long white contrail in its wake. Inside, the atmosphere had undergone a profound transformation. The tension and unspoken prejudice that had once filled the cabin were gone, replaced by an uncanny stillness. Claudia Pierce, sitting at the far end of the first-class section, no longer tried to mask her emotions. She watched Samuel from a distance, her thoughts quietly echoing. This man is more than a genius. He is a living testament to grace and kindness. Taking a deep breath, she turned to her younger colleagues, who had witnessed everything unfold. Leaning toward them, she spoke softly, her words weighted with significance. Never let your assumptions guide you. Always seek the truth before making any decision. That's the lesson I've learned today. In the economy cabin, Zara Bennett couldn't take her eyes off her phone screen. She had finished drafting her notes and was now moving on to the next part. Mr. Samuel Drake has taught me that justice doesn't always come from the courts. It doesn't reside in the thick tomes of legal doctrine. Justice begins in the heart, with the willingness to admit fault and the courage to make it right. Closing her phone, Zara leaned back in her seat, feeling an unexpected lightness within her. She closed her eyes, her mind drifting to a vision of the future, a courtroom, herself standing at its center, defending those who needed it most. Justice isn't just something you speak about, it's something you act on. Victor Harlan, who had always carried the confident demeanor of a successful businessman, now sat still, his gaze fixed on the window. His encounter with Samuel had forced him to confront himself, a confrontation that was neither comfortable nor easy. But Victor wasn't avoiding it anymore. He nodded faintly, as if making a pact with himself. "It's time to change, Victor. Not for anyone else, but for yourself." In the economy cabin, passengers who had previously been indifferent now spoke quietly among themselves about Samuel. A woman turned to her husband, whispering, "It's incredible to think he's the man behind the safety of flights like this. We truly owe him so much." Her husband nodded in agreement, adding, "Yes, but what I admire most is how he handled everything with such calm and kindness. I don't think I could have done the same." Samuel overheard the faint murmurs behind him, but didn't turn around. Instead, he flipped the page of his book and continued reading a chapter about the earliest pioneers of aviation. Those brave souls who had defied prejudice and transcended the limits of their time. Western Sky Flight 128 landed safely on the runway at San Francisco International Airport. The afternoon sky was a pristine blue, and sunlight streamed through the plane's windows, casting a warm, golden glow over the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at San Francisco International Airport. Thank you for flying with Western Sky. Have a wonderful day," the soft voice of the flight attendant announced over the intercom. Passengers began to rise from their seats, gathering their belongings and making their way toward the exit. The quiet murmurs gradually faded into silence. Yet in the first-class cabin, no one could forget what had just unfolded. Eyes lingered on Samuel Drake as he stood, retrieved his small suitcase from beneath his seat, and slowly made his way toward the door. As Samuel stepped off the plane, a small group of ground staff awaited him on the tarmac. Leading them was a senior Western Sky official, impeccably dressed in a black suit. He bowed slightly in deference, his demeanor radiating respect. "Mr. Drake," the official said, his voice filled with admiration, "Captain Wells informed us of your presence on this flight. It is a tremendous honor to have you aboard our airline. Samuel inclined his head slightly, a faint, modest smile playing on his lips. Thank you, he replied. But today isn't about me. It's about everyone in aviation. Those who work tirelessly to ensure every flight is safe. The ground staffer seemed eager to say more, but Samuel's gentle smile and subtle nod conveyed that no further acknowledgement was necessary. Despite the formal welcome, he remained as unassuming as ever. Captain Gordon Wells emerged from the cockpit, standing silently at the airplane door, his expression one of deep respect. As Samuel passed by, Gordon raised a hand in a crisp salute, a gesture he seldom reserved for anyone. Samuel paused briefly, his gaze and a warm smile conveying his gratitude. Captain Wells, he said in his low, steady voice, you handled everything with great courage. Not everyone has the bravery to stand up and speak the truth. Gordon's lips curved into a small, humble smile. Mr. Drake, what I did today is nothing compared to your contributions. Thank you for everything you've done for this industry. Samuel nodded, a simple but profoundly meaningful gesture. Justice always needs people like you. As Samuel walked away, Gordon's eyes remained fixed on him, a silent farewell to a man he deeply revered. The small suitcase Samuel carried rolled smoothly across the terminal floor, blending into the flow of travelers. Yet his presence lingered, etched into the hearts of everyone who had been on Flight 128 that day. Samuel walked slowly through the crowded airport terminal. The steady hum of flight announcements blended with the sound of rolling luggage wheels skimming across the floor. He maintained his calm demeanor unhurried, his eyes quietly taking in the bustling scene around him. Zara Bennett, a small backpack slung over her shoulder, weaved her way through the crowd, hurrying to catch up with Samuel. Her curly hair was slightly disheveled after the long flight, but her eyes were bright, filled with determination. Mr. Drake, she called out, her voice slightly breathless. Samuel stopped. He turned to face her, his gaze calm but warm. Zara hesitated for a moment, as if summoning every ounce of courage to speak. Sorry to bother you, she began, her breathing still uneven. But I just have to say, your words on the flight, they were incredibly inspiring to me. Samuel raised an eyebrow slightly, tilting his head in a quiet invitation for her to continue. Zara took a deep breath, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. You made me realize that courage and kindness are just as important as the law when it comes to justice. I'm a law student, and I want to be a lawyer who doesn't just argue cases but fights for what's right. Samuel's eyes softened, his expression both gentle and serious as he listened to her earnest words. He stepped closer, placing a hand on Zara's shoulder, a gesture both comforting and profoundly meaningful. Always believe in justice, Samuel said, his voice deep and resolute. But remember, justice isn't found only in the rigid words of the law. It lives in the hearts of those who have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Zara felt a wave of emotion swell within her. His words were more than advice. They were an affirmation of faith. She smiled, her heart brimming with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. Thank you, Mr. Drake, she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. I'll never forget your words, and I promise, I'll do everything I can to become someone worthy of your belief. Samuel nodded, a faint trace of satisfaction crossing his face. You will, he replied simply, yet with unshakable confidence. Zara watched as Samuel turned and continued on his way, his small suitcase rolling smoothly across the floor. In that moment, she understood she had encountered someone extraordinary, not just for his accomplishments, but for his humility, his kindness, and his unwavering commitment to what was right. She bowed her head slightly and whispered to herself, "Thank you, Mr. Drake. I won't forget." Samuel continued walking through the bustling terminal, blending into the hurried crowd. Yet, unlike them, he did not rush, nor did he let the frantic rhythm of the airport dictate his pace. He moved quietly, deliberately, as though every step had been thoughtfully measured. In Zara's mind, Samuel's words echoed like a cherished lesson handed down personally to her. Justice isn't confined to the law. It resides in the heart. She knew those words weren't meant solely for her, but for anyone who had ever harbored prejudice or been shaped by it. Elsewhere in the terminal, Victor Harlan waited for his private driver. He stood still, his usual air of urgency noticeably absent. The events of Flight 128 played in his mind like a mirror, forcing him to confront truths he had long ignored. Victor reflected silently. If Samuel Drake can face prejudice with such calm and kindness, why can't I? For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a desire to change. Not for anyone else, but for the fairness he owed to himself. At the baggage claim area, Claudia Pierce, the lead flight attendant, was assisting passengers with their luggage. Her face bore a quiet, contemplative expression. Today's experience had left an indelible mark on her. Taking a deep breath, she resolved, I won't let ignorance or bias guide me again. As Samuel stepped through the large glass doors leading out of the airport, he paused momentarily. Turning back, he cast one last glance at the terminal, where the flight had safely delivered him and the other passengers. A faint smile crossed his face. Prejudice is humanity's greatest barrier, he thought. But if we're brave enough to acknowledge it and change, anything is possible. Then he moved on, the golden light of the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over his tall yet humble figure. The small suitcase at his side rolled steadily across the floor, mirroring the steady rhythm of his journey through the years. A journey marked by hope and a belief in a fairer future. In the distance, the airport's constant hum continued. Yet for those who had been aboard Flight 128, the noise seemed far away. Each of them knew they had experienced something transformative, a lesson not just about a journey through the skies, but about an awakening within themselves. Flight 128 didn't just take us from New York to San Francisco. It brought us closer to one another, beyond the barriers we construct within our own hearts. Samuel Drake's story aboard Flight 128 reflects a sobering reality. Prejudice remains a quiet undercurrent in everyday life, often unnoticed but profoundly impactful. Prejudice can lead to poor decisions, causing harm to others and ourselves. In today's world, it is vital to learn to understand, to listen, and to judge people by their true worth, not by appearances. Open your heart to differences, learn from those around you, and have the courage to admit when you are wrong. It is through the change within each individual that we can build a more just and progressive society. This story is just the beginning. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional and meaningful videos. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments and spread the message.